In America, is there a war on cars? And if so, which side should you be on? Joining me this episode is Aaron Naparstek. He's the founder of Streets Blog, and he's currently one of the hosts of the War on Cars podcast. We discuss car culture in America, why we're so dependent on cars, and why car culture is harmful in the first place. We talk about the politics involved here. Is it smart branding to talk about a war on cars? Is there any hope for political change on car culture in the future? All this and more in this episode as we figure out how we can move forward for a more pedestrian and transit-friendly future. As always, if you want to support the podcast, please like and subscribe and hit those notification buttons. If you want to join our Patreon, you can do so at patreon.com/neoliberalpodcast. And you can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. We appreciate everyone's support and hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Neoliberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and my guest today is Aaron Naparstek. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Thanks for having me, Jeremiah.
So, as we mentioned in the intro, you're the host, one of many hosts. I think there's three hosts, co-hosts of this podcast, The War on Cars. And my first question is just, why that name? Why The War on Cars? That sounds like something that somebody who is very pro-car would say about what you're trying to do. What was the kind of thought process behind no, we're going to lean into that. We're going to name ourselves The War on Cars.
Exactly. Yeah. So when my co-hosts, Doug Gordon and Sarah Goodyear and I were coming up with the podcast back in, it was like the summer of 2018. One of the issues that we were grappling with is something that we've all faced as, in our work as local advocates working on, progressive transportation policy in cities. Sarah's actually more of a journalist than an advocate, but she's faced this as well, where, just about any effort to try to get, say like a new bike lane or a new bus lane, or even just like a bike, rack, a place to lock your bikes in front of your kid's school. Almost any time you try to do something like this, someone inevitably jumps up and accuses you of waging a war on cars. It's like, how dare you take away that parking spot? This is a war on cars. It was just a phrase that came up a lot, especially back then. The phrase actually started with Mayor Rob Ford, the former mayor of Toronto, who was really elected on a kind of anti-bike, anti-transit, kind of pro-suburban single-family house car commuter platform. And he kind of ran on the war on cars. So, when we were coming up with the idea for the podcast, which touches on these issues in lots of different ways, we thought, if they're saying we're waging a war on cars, why don't we just go with that? Why don't we just say, okay, yes, we are. Let's own it. We're waging a war on cars, and come join us. A war is something that, other people can join.
Yeah.
So, it's a little bit provocative.
There's value in that, in being provocative intentionally. And look,
exactly.
I'm someone who started an online movement called Neoliberal. So I get the idea that sometimes you're provocative on purpose, and but part of me does wonder, to play devil's advocate, kind of against myself as well, I guess. But devil's advocate is this seems like it might actually be a pretty successful framing for kind of the anti-urbanist, the person who loves car culture and wants to use transit and bikes as like a stick to hit you with. And win political battles. And when I think of Rob Ford, I think of all the other crazy stuff he did. And there's a lot of Rob Ford stuff out there for you people who don't follow Canadian politics. He's a kind of a crazy wild guy, but it sounds like he actually got elected not based on the crazy stuff, but based on like meat and potatoes, I will protect your car kind of stuff. And are you handing them a win? I guess is my question.
I mean, you know, the entire culture is handing them a win. You know, we live in
Fair
a
enough,
car
yeah.
culture. So, um, you know, car culture is so dominant that it's almost invisible to us, you know, as like the famous, I believe Marshall McLuhan line, you know, that water is invisible to the fish. Um, so, you know, handing car culture and the automobile industry and all of the various forces, I sometimes like to call it the, you know, auto sprawl industrial complex. You know, the idea of handing them a win with the name of our podcast, it just doesn't even really register in a certain way, because I feel like it's just such an enormous hunk of our culture that we're sort of trying to um, make visible and critique. But, you know, from a raw politics perspective, yeah, people still do use this term, and they feel very strongly about it. There is no doubt that Doug, Sarah, and myself, we all do come at this from a very specific New York City kind of, you know, we live in the middle of a big northeastern city, and that one of the most walkable, bikeable, transit friendly cities in North America. So, and it's a place where, if anywhere, if there is any place in North America where it is like truly absurd to let cars be the dominant mode of transportation, it is like the heart of New York City.
Yeah. I'm a New Yorker. It drives me crazy when I see people like complaining that cars are disrespected in New York City, because I'm like, the other 99% of the country you could go live in, but you live
Exactly.
here, so you don't get to complain about like your car. But do any of you guys own cars, by the way? Any of the three
Um,
co-hosts?
in fact, I am the only car owner of the three of us. I actually, yeah. So, which is, you know, it is a big hit on my credibility as a war on cars fighter, depending on how you look at it.
Should we try to change it up and like call it the wars on pedestrians or something like that? Because I feel like that is the actual war. Is there's kind of this, you know, pedestrians are the ones in danger, not cars.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's sort of less amusing, or not something to like even make light of, because you know, truly, in fact, you know, cars are killing, you know, record numbers of pedestrians and cyclists and vulnerable road users outside of cars. So, I mean, that is actually, you know, one of the core issues, is that we have this transportation technology, this mode of transport that that kills over 40,000 people each year in the United States. I mean, it's just a
Hmm.
staggering number. You know, it's almost like a Vietnam Wars level worth of casualties. And so, you know, the war on cars is like a way of trying to like, you know, that's also kind of a joke. But I mean, to me, it's even a little bit serious. Like, why aren't we fighting back against this personal mobility technology that is literally, you know, killing us in the street
Yeah.
constantly? So,
Yeah, and I mean, it's like it almost seems like a status quo bias to me, that like, well, it's always been this way, so we're just going to kind of accept it. Obviously, when a new thing appears, if there's some new disease that killed 40,000 Americans, we've seen a new disease pop up recently that did quite a lot more than that. But when something new and scary comes, people typically have like a very strong reaction. We've got to do something. But this is like, well, it's just always been this way. This is the water we're swimming in, like you said. And so like there's no urgency the way there would be for other problems.
and you know, it's really strange in this country in particular for there not to be urgency. You think about how litigious the United States is in general, how many other things are stopped and postponed or killed. Good projects that you talk about on your podcast all the time. How many of these kinds of things are stopped, you know, for litigious reasons, because there's some kind of abstract hazard that might happen in the future.
We might disturb the three-toed sloths mating grounds in some obscure wetland, and therefore we can't build, wind power or solar power anywhere in the country. That kind of thing.
Exactly. And, you know, I might even be on the sloth side on that one. Who knows? But it is wild to me that there's this enormous piece of our daily lives and our culture that we just sort of accept as yeah, sure, it's gonna kill 41,000 of us or more next year. It's gonna injure 1.5 million of us. It's gonna do irreparable harm to global climate with its emissions. It's going to make us individually and personally less healthy, less happy because we're using our bodies less to move around. It's going to degrade our cities and encourage and facilitate really destructive suburban sprawl. I mean, the list goes on and on. We're going to fight wars for the fossil fuel resources that we need to maintain this personal mobility technology. It's really wild, when you think about the extent we go to keep our cars running. If anything, it suggests that maybe we just really love our cars that much, but also, there's a lot about cars that suggest that we're actually quite unhappy with this system too. So
Yeah.
It's strange.
It's funny. So the notes I have on this podcast were, number one, let's do a fun open, just why the war on cars, a little bit of banter there. And then my second note was, tell me why you're so upset. What's so bad about cars? But I think we've gotten there. I think I think we've started into that topic without me even having to bring it up. I do want to explore kind of the full range of this, though, because I don't think it's a unidimensional thing. It's not just, well, people die from car crashes and that's bad and we should stop that. There's kind of a whole range of reasons. So you mentioned, the direct injuries that result. You mentioned climate. Are there other more subtle reasons that you think car culture is a negative for society?
I mean, I'll tell you, my entry point into this entire issue set was horn honking. Simple, like the most mundane, stupid daily thing. But
Aaron, I live on an avenue in Manhattan. It's
so you get it.
It's bad.
I mean, if anything will drive a person to the war on cars, it's the horn honking, as far as I'm concerned. But that for me, I moved to an apartment in Brooklyn in the late 90s, so a pretty long time ago now. And it just so happened that the street I lived on had a ton of horn honking happening right in front of my apartment. At first I found it really distracting, and then I found it just really difficult to live with. And at the time I was working as a web producer, sort of doing a lot of interface design and consulting for Internet 1.0 startups back then, prior to the first .com crash. And, being someone who was really focused on, web traffic and user interface design, I got really interested in the user interface design of the street in front of my apartment and why it was so dysfunctional and why the users were so unhappy that they were constantly honking in this one spot. It just seemed like this must be a solvable problem. So, I started delving into that and going to local community meetings and putting my journalist hat on and calling, DOT staff and personnel until I finally nagged my way all the way to the guy who was in charge of the traffic lights on my block. It was really hard to get to this guy. He did not want to talk to a random, crazy citizen. And I remember this conversation. It was so eye-opening for me. I was trying to explain the ways in which I saw the street as being broken and dysfunctional and bad for the neighborhood. And he was look, I got to tell you, we've actually responded to your complaints. We've examined the street. We've been out there and looked at it, and it's working as it should. Everything is good with your street. And I was well, tell me about that. How did you examine the problem? And he's yeah, sure. I mean, we drove through a few times, in our cars, and it was sure, it was a little traffic, but we made it through. And I was oh, right. This New York City's traffic engineers are they see the city streets as a problem to be solved for cars. Their perspective on the city is from the driver's seat. they have a windshield perspective on what's happening here. Like, my concerns as someone who lived next to the street, as someone who biked on the street, walked on the street, did not register for these people. And that just seemed so fundamentally,
That's an eye-opening story, man. That's
it
eye-opening.
was so wrong to me that I was like, wow, like I want to work on this more. So that's what got me into it.
One of the things that I've always really cared about and kind of radicalized me a little bit in this direction is the pollution aspect. And it's funny because you mentioned honking, and I treat that as a form of pollution. Like noise pollution is a real thing. But, I, at some point a few years back, was reading like the economic research. And it's a lot of economists who do this research for some reason, because maybe they have the statistical tools to do it. But they do like research on like particulate matter in the air and how that impacts, different populations, different things we care about. Like, do people have more strokes and heart attacks when there's more particulate matter? Do children's IQ results like go down? And there's like all these different health and well-being outcomes. And like all of them tend to like drop like a rock when there's particulate matter in the air. They call it PM 2.5. And like that, you read that research and like the numbers are like shockingly high. Like you were like, it couldn't possibly have that big of an effect. But then you read another paper on a totally separate problem, and it also has a huge effect. And you read another paper, and just like living near, high concentrations of cars and in places where they're going to be creating this kind of particulate matter, this kind of pollution, it's just a really big deal. It's something we really need to care about. That's one of the things that I've always thought is, one of those less appreciated reasons why we've got to try where we can to transition away from like car-focused cities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge issue. And obviously, the people who tend to live in more traffic choked places and the places with worse air pollution are, poorer people, less advantaged people, Black and brown people. So, that becomes an issue of social justice as well, like where we've put our highways and big arterials. Increasingly you're seeing cities that don't want to build more affordable housing, but are sort of being forced to build more affordable housing, are often trying to put that housing on, big wide arterials with lots of car traffic and lots of air pollution. So it's a huge issue. And, even just, my own neighborhood and my own community, so many kids growing up around my own kids have asthma, which is, it's like a really debilitating lifelong condition. And that's probably due to the fact that, we're just growing up amidst a lot of air pollution. Not to harken back to the good old days of the pandemic, like it was some great thing, but there was that moment around April of 2020 where, cities had been in lockdown for a really long time and, car traffic was vastly reduced. And I don't know if you remember like those images that were coming across the internet of these kind of urban vistas of distant mountains and, just air within the city itself and, very polluted places like Bangalore, India, that, all of a sudden, there was all this blue sky, all this pollution had vanished because in large part we had stopped using gas burning personal mobility products in our cities. And it was something that I felt like, man, I wish we could hold on to this moment and just be like, yeah, this is something that we want. Once this pandemic thing is over and things start to get back to normal, I hope we remember how crystalline and clear this sky was and how fresh this air was so that we sort of demand to have that again. And, obviously that didn't really seem to happen.
So one common thing that I hear when I have these kind of discussions, either in real life or on the internet, I hear that, well, this is how people want to live. You're talking about things, and maybe we even acknowledge that these are negative things. There's a lot of people who die in car crashes and pollution makes us sick and all this stuff. But people are doing this because they want to. They like having cars. So, ultimately, what can we do about it if these are the choices that people make? How would you respond to someone kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, well, people are going to do what people are going to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to respond to that. There's sort of the market-based response, which is that, look, like, the most expensive and valuable and therefore presumably the most desired real estate places to live in this country are urban centers, places where you actually can live your entire life fully and completely without the burden of owning a car, without the burden of, maintaining a lawn or a single family house. But maybe you rent an apartment, maybe you own a condo, get around by subway, bus, bike, walking. These are, the market would suggest these are truly the most desirable places in the country. So, and also perhaps the most limited in supply, which is why they're so expensive. I think there's a way in which Americans really aren't being given much choice. And we're kind of locked into this automobile sprawl pattern of living that forces us to have a car. So the notion that like we can prefer to have a car, prefer to have a suburban house, most places just don't really have all that much choice. I think that's often my first response, and my second response is more of a historic response, in that there is this kind of interesting hidden history in the United States of rebellion, sometimes like truly violent and angry rebellion against the encroachment of the automobile on public spaces. One of the best books on this is Peter Norton's book, Fighting Traffic, if you ever wanted to kind of delve into this. But he just sort of recounts how in the 1920s and 30s, as the car started to enter into big cities especially, citizens were furious about it. They were deeply angered by like this kind of annexation of their street space, which previously had been used for all kinds of activities, pushcart vendors and kids playing ball. And, you could kind of walk where you wanted and stop and talk to people. And now all of a sudden there were these like big, dirty, loud contraptions, mostly owned by very wealthy people that were the early adopters to cars. And they were kind of taking over the street. And you can draw a line from the stories that Peter Norton tells about the 1920s and 30s and the rebellion against the automobile at that time. You can draw it, straight into the freeway revolts of the 60s and 70s and even the 80s. Sorry, I skipped over Jane Jacobs and the whole kind of fight against highways encroaching the city in the 50s and 60s. But there's a kind of a through line over the last 90, even 100 years of people actually being very, very upset about automobiles and all of the things you need for automobiles, especially big roads, sort of decimating community spaces, town, village, city, and city centers in the U.S. So I think there's a lot of evidence that people, in fact, would really like lots of different options and not to be forced into this kind of automobile dominant lifestyle.
I'm kind of two minds here. I go back and forth on this because I think what you're describing, there's a lot of ways in which society is kind of silently set up to promote car culture and to promote car ownership. And it's ways that you don't really see. It kind of does remove the choice. It's not really like a free choice people are making. For instance, even in like New York City, the most urban, least car friendly place in the country, maybe. And even in New York City, like something like a quarter of the city is like parking spaces. I've read there's like 12 Central Parks worth of parking spaces. There's 3 million free on-street parking spaces. And that's not something anybody decided, like market-based. We all just, our natural preference was to have 3 million parking spaces. That's something a designer made that choice along the way. a series of people who planned New York City kind of made the choice to have 3 million parking spaces. And there's a lot of ways you can talk about that, and like how our suburbs were planned, and centrally, centralized policies kind of led to a lot of this stuff. And so I think I agree with you in general that like there's just a lot of ways in which it's not really people expressing their preferences, that we just love cars and we always want to be dependent on cars, and that's just what we are. But I do think even if we had some sort of perfect idealized society with perfect policy, like there would still be a lot of people who just wanted to have a single family home out in the suburbs and to drive a car a lot. And it would probably be a lesser amount than it is today, but like that kind of person would still exist. And so I think like, well, what are we going to do about that person? Should we be actively discouraging that person, or should we be just planning for like less harmful cars? How do you think about that kind of, dichotomy there?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right on the money with all that. There's nothing there that I really disagree with. I think there's two things that I look at. Like one is, it's not an all or nothing proposition. Like, we have to have a world with cars or without cars. I think sometimes we get into this, and especially when you name your podcast "The War on Cars," you get into this kind of idea that it's one or the other. And I think there's obviously like a place for the personal automobile, for personal mobility is the way that I like to think of it, because it could be done by lots of other devices aside from automobiles, gas burning automobiles. But there's a place for the car, and it's just a question of like how much car, where, when. How is it regulated? How is it driven? Like, do we really need Dodge Chargers that can go 200 miles per hour? Should those really be like an unfettered form of personal mobility in a big crowded city? I think that's pretty crazy that we allow that. But there are other smaller, lighter cars, maybe even that look more like electric golf carts, that might supply a lot of the personal mobility demand that we have. So that's the first thing, is it's not all or nothing. There's a lot of other, we're kind of locked into this one model for how we think of the car. And there's other ways to think about what a car might be. And if you look at places like some of the best cities in the world for biking, for transit, for walking, you can look at places like Amsterdam, Copenhagen, all kinds of cities in Europe and Asia, even South America, places like Bogota are doing great things. These are places that often also have lots of cars, lots of single family homes. They have suburbs that Americans would recognize as suburbs. But, a lot of those trips from the suburb to the city center, or the suburb to your kid's school, those can be done without a car. So it's not all or nothing. It's like you can have a car in a garage in a suburb of Copenhagen, but maybe only use it, a couple of times a month. And I think like that's a place that a lot of Americans would probably like to get to, but we're mostly not being given the opportunity or the freedom.
There's there's the famous, this is like a famous thing that happens on online arguments, where people will talk about like, why do Americans love European cities so much? It's because they don't have to drive cars to get around them. They love walking around Rome, or walking around, Barcelona or wherever. Or I've even seen like, why do you like Disney World? Because it's mixed use, walkable urbanism. Why do you have such fond memories of college? Well, your campus was probably mixed use, walkable area, and to some extent, I think there's truth there, that when people are exposed to that kind of thing, they do end up enjoying it a lot. Like, I like a walkable city. Almost everybody who experiences a walkable environment ends up liking it.
Absolutely. I mean, we've done some Disney stuff on the podcast. My co-host Doug is very into Disney, and on a variety of levels. And
is Doug is he one of those Disney people? Is he like
everybody
knows who we're talking about, like the Disney people? Take it a little too far.
I don't know. I don't know if we can fully call him a Disney person, but I don't want to speak for Doug on that front, but but no, the idea that like we do in fact pay a lot of money on our vacations, go well out of our way to have that experience of being able to walk down a car free facsimile of a village or town main street as it once was. That's the centerpiece of both Disneyland and Disney World. Not to mention their futuristic, monorail travel that good old Walt thought would be the future of transportation. So, yeah, no, I think there is a actually that is I feel that with the college campus thing. I do think a lot of kids who grow up in suburbs, end up on a college campus and are just kind of like, wow, this is a really nice way to live. Everything I need is within walking distance. I've even spoken with a couple of college students about that recently at WashU, my alma mater in St. Louis. Lots of suburban kids there, and yeah, I think there's real truth to that.
One of the best statistics I've seen on this, I think, comes from Noah Smith, who writes the No Opinion Substack.
Yep.
And I think he's got a line where it's something like, even in like the best country for this in the world, let's say like Japan, which has immaculate public transit. Tokyo has some of the best subway systems in the world. They've got bullet trains. They're just public transit is super great there. So many Japanese cities are like super walkable. They're definitely not built around cars in the same way that like a lot of other cities are. But even in Japan, I think it's above 60% of people own a car. And so his point in saying this is that even if you get like all the policy you ever want, you're not going to be getting rid of cars. So the next step is, well, you've got to figure out, how do we live with cars? So I guess that's a question I would throw at you. Let's assume that we get a lot of the things that we want. We get great public transit. We build our cities a little differently so they have good transit, good walkability. But even in that scenario, you're still going to have, car crashes are still going to be happening. There's still going to be some pollution happening. There's still going to be fossil fuel dependence. So what other policies would you like to see to kind of mitigate the harms from cars that can't be avoided to some extent? If car usage can't be avoided entirely, what else would be helpful to make it less harmful?
Yes, that's a really important point. And it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. I back in 2005 or six, I founded this publication called Streets Blog, and one of the goals of Streets Blog was to try to get people to think differently about how city streets are designed and managed. So it was a very sort of like urban design, urban planning focused approach where, the thinking behind it was like, look, like, if we start to redesign streets in places like New York and other big cities, we can start to carve out more space here for other modes, for non-automobile modes like bicycles and buses, and make those modes better, and people will start to move to those other modes. And in many ways that has borne out over the last 20 years. We've really seen increases in biking, especially in big cities that have made those changes. But over the course of kind of everybody, I don't say everybody, but lots and lots of advocates all around the country, getting really focused on street design, I think we lost a little bit of focus on the motor vehicles themselves. The personal mobility products that are actually using the streets. And it sounds like, as Noah has pointed out, lots and lots of people still own cars. We have to learn how to live with the car. And I think one of the really big areas of policy and regulation that we now need to focus on is what kind of car, what kind of personal mobility product is most appropriate especially for big, densely populated urban places.
Yeah.
We have designed cars. We have all of our regulations have focused on designing cars that are really big and heavy and can withstand, 100-mile-an-hour crashes on the highway or whatever. And maybe that's not the most appropriate type of personal mobility product for cities. Maybe we don't want gas burning personal mobility products anymore either.
I think we should point out like cars are very useful. We've talked a lot about the harms that cars do, and I think they do significant harms. There's significant reasons that they're harmful, but that doesn't mean that like they're not helpful. People do buy them because they have very obvious benefits. And it's like, how do we get all of the benefits and the freedoms that come with owning a car while minimizing the stuff that we've been talking about? You know, it wouldn't do any good to pretend like cars are just pure evil. Obviously, they have some benefits. Like they're good for people in some ways. In obvious ways, even. Like it sounds silly to say like to make the point cars can be helpful, but like obviously they can be helpful. Otherwise, why would we pay $40,000 for a car?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the helpful parts of the car are almost never what you see in the car ads. You see, they're not selling cars for the most part on their utility. They're selling cars on other things like how they make you feel and how they make other road users feel, scared, intimidated. They're selling cars on, you know, how they will impact your status in your community and society, and how they look. It's like it's funny that you bring up the utility thing. I think because it's like it's so often not really the way that cars are sold at all. And if you really look around, especially what's happening in New York City. I mean, one of the really interesting things is you see that so many of these tasks that we think need to be done by, cars, trucks, Ford F-350 pickups, can be done much more effectively on things like cargo bikes, electric powered cargo bikes. There are all these new fangled personal mobility products powered by small electric motors that are popping up that are incredibly useful. Probably a lot more useful, in fact, than a lifted pickup truck with a pickup bed that's 6 feet off the ground and hard to reach. And this idea that we're buying cars because they're useful to us. I mean, I wish that were the case, because I think if it were really about utility, we would be buying entirely other and different personal mobility products.
Yeah, I mean, the last time I had a car, I moved to New York and sold my car a decade ago. So it's been a hot minute. It's been more than 10 years, I think, since I owned a car. But my car was a Yaris, which was like the smallest, most fuel efficient car I could get. And like, I feel like I have a pretty good argument that I was getting that for utility reasons. I needed something to get me from point A to point B. I lived in the suburbs. So it was necessary and it was pretty fuel efficient. But I think you're right. That's not the typical car purchase. The typical car in America does not look like a Yaris. But
right.
But I'm curious. I'd love to kind of transition to talking about the politics of this.
Yeah,
because we keep naturally, like, you guys are all New Yorkers. I'm a New Yorker. We're guilty of the sin of always making everything about New York, which like it's a great city. I love it. There's a reason I live here, but I'm sure there's a lot of people listening who are thinking like, okay, all this is great. Like, you change New York the way you want to change it, but I don't want to live in New York. I don't want to live in a downtown area. I like what I'm doing right now. Like, how does any of this impact me? Like, why should I not just take you as my political enemy that you're trying to make me live in New York City when I don't want to? I mean, and this is kind of it's a little bit silly to say that, but there are going to be people who feel like, people get threatened by change. And I feel like we have to think about how this plays politically. So what do you have a message that's more tailored to people who live in like rural or suburban areas?
Yeah, I mean, the politics around this are very difficult. Again, it's like we live in this culture and this economy that is quite literally driven by cars. And so, as you note, people feel very threatened by change in general. And like this change is something that, often generates lots and lots of pushback. It's hard to talk about it in a general sense because there's so many, transportation, it just intersects with so many other issues. So, for example, like there's a big housing component to all of this. Like, if you truly want to make places less automobile dependent, then you need to give people ways to get around without a car. And part of that can mean just like building more densely in suburban centers in places that are currently car dependent, that might have good transit opportunities, that might have good biking and walking opportunities, but they really don't because like the sort of density of housing is not there. And so this is a big fight that's starting to pop up in lots of blue states, especially right now. California, obviously, with all of its new housing legislation, and it's actually coming up in New York too right now as people are starting to talk more seriously in the
Hmm.
governor's office about making places like suburban places in Long Island, sort of pushing them and incentivizing them and
Yeah.
penalizing them to build more housing.
Kathy Hochul had a really good, a pretty, I will say, somewhere between pretty good and really good plan for housing, for building more housing. And I think the New York State Senate has kind of gutted it, is my understanding. I'm not following that super closely, but it's disappointing, but it's the first step towards something, maybe. There is something interesting that I've noticed, and I don't know if this is a national trend or if it's just a couple places, but I've almost noticed something encouraging where there will be some suburban areas where it's the suburbs, it's car dependent. But I almost noticed like the little suburban towns are almost now focusing on building little town centers, and
Yes.
they're not like I think around Atlanta. There's Cobb County and Gwinnett County and Alpharetta, and my family lives in a lot of this area. And I notice a lot of these towns outside of Atlanta, the little suburban cities, all of them are starting to like advertise their little downtowns, and these are like very kind of small walkable areas, but it's almost like that's a little encouraging to me that they're trying to make these little towns outside Atlanta more walkable and bikeable and like build condos close to the little historic town center. And I don't know if that's like a sustainable model moving forward. I don't know if that's the ideal, but it seems like a positive change. I don't know. Have you noticed anything like this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's like there's a real revival of village, town, and city centers all across America, and it very much is, to my mind, a response to 20th century automobile oriented urban planning. And I think we've sort of come to the end of that mode of designing our living environment. And I think so we're living at the tail end of that experiment of forcing everybody to own and maintain and use a car for just about everything.
Well, let me expand the question here. I want to expand
Hmm.
it just to say you've been doing this for a long time. You've been talking about
Yes.
urbanist related issues for decades now. And how have you seen the politics of this change over time? Because you're talking about this
Mm.
historical perspective. How have you
Yes.
seen the politics specifically change?
Sure. I mean, I'll just speak to New York then very specifically because that's where I've been like doing most of my work for the last 25 years on this. And it's changed a lot. It's changed a lot. It used to be that you could, you would have a big months long fight to just get like a measly, like sharrows, like not even a bike lane, but like just little markings on the pavement that said like, yeah, like bikes belong here. Please don't run them over. This would be a months long battle. It would be like pitched warfare almost, like you'd really be going toe to toe with neighborhood people who are like, you're destroying our way of life. You're waging war on cars, blah, blah, blah. And that's really changed. I mean, like we're now in a place where, like the idea of like biking around New York is pretty normal, and there are lots and lots of people biking, and there's these like little battles, these little fights, like that difficult fight you had in like 2006 to get that bike lane. Well, that encouraged more people to actually ride a bike. Like that made people feel safer. It actually did make people feel, actually did make them safer. And it encouraged more people to use that mode of transportation. And now that we have more people biking, we have a bigger constituency politically for biking. So, I think it's really, we call ourselves the war on cars. It's a little bit of a negative framing, but the idea of like just getting improvements in, getting things that make your town center more walkable, more bikeable, more friendly to people who are outside of cars. You're not really focusing on like, hey, we want to take away your car. We want to make it harder for you to drive. Like you're focusing on these other benefits and actually putting them in place and building a constituency for them. And I think that is broadly how the politics of this moves forward.
All right, so we've got just a little bit of time left. As far as policies go, I know there's like a ton of policies that we could be implementing. We could probably talk about dozens of different policy changes, big and small, that would be good here, that would be good for moving us marginally away from car culture into something a little bit healthier. I'll ask, I want to ask the question this way. First, what is like the biggest, most important policy change? If you could fix one thing, if you had the emperor's touch and wave your magic wand and you could fix like one thing, what would be your first policy choice that you think would have the biggest impact? And then the second thing is, what do you think is an underrated thing that people don't pay enough attention to? And maybe it's a small thing, but just it's something that you think should be getting more attention. It's not the big obvious change. Because look, we could talk about like dozens of policies, but I'm going to try to restrict us to like, let's just mention two of the big ones. So what's your most important one? And then what's your like underrated one?
Oh man, that's such a good question. It's actually hard because I have so many obscure, weird little policies that I'd like to do.
I love a good, obscure, weird little policy. Like those are magic words for me.
It's interesting too, because I feel like is my big one, my underrated one? Is my underrated one my big one? So look, I think that, all right, I'll throw out two areas. I'm going to skip the realm of housing policy entirely. Okay. Like, let's just knock that off the table because there's too much there. But like on the transportation front and thinking in a very like New York-y way, so apologies to all the non-New Yorkers. I think the big one that really needs to happen is a sort of new form of regulation of the automobile. We kind of need a new Ralph Nader moment like we had in the 1970s where good old Ralph, who's still with us, he kind of went out there and said, hey, like the automobile industry is putting these products out that are killing lots of people and they're incredibly dangerous and destructive, and they don't have to be that way. And I think we need a new version of that. And it needs to be oriented around the vulnerable road users outside of the car, especially because frankly, cars have gotten very, very safe for the people inside of the cars. One of the ways that they've done that is by making cars enormous like tanks. So, but it's clear that we're in a kind of arms race on our nation's like roads and on our city streets. We see these like enormous and overpowered vehicles, super inefficient, hog a lot of space, terrible visibility, very, very dangerous and distracting inside the cockpit. So I feel like that is the big policy that really needs to be focused on. And unfortunately, the automobile is mostly regulated at the federal level. So and most of the advocacy energy is at the local level, is in the municipal local level. So there's a real disconnect there. And it's a hard one to solve because obviously the car people, the automobile industry people are much more powerful inside the Beltway than the kind of bike advocates and bike walk transit advocates are. You know what I mean? So I'd say that's my big policy. And then I'd say my obscure, somewhat underrated policy is this idea of like, I really want to put together what I think of as a curbside coalition. Like I think the curb, the city curb is the kind of the front line in the battle of the war on cars, and figuring out how to manage and account for what is happening on the curb is crucial and absolutely an underrated thing in our whole sort of transportation realm. So to try to explain this a little better, like you think about what's happening at the curbside for most big city curbsides these days, and it's just free car storage. We let people store their enormous pieces of private property for free on this public space. It's just a gigantic subsidy. It's a giveaway to the minority of New York City residents who own cars. I mean, it is a minority in New York City. So, which is just a crazy policy if you think about it. Like you think about how valuable space is in the city. And then there's all these other uses we could have at our curb. A curb could be a dedicated bike lane. A curb could be a dedicated busway. A curb could be, a pop-up cafe, like seating for restaurants. It could be bike racks. It could be garbage cans, so we don't have to just put garbage bags all over the sidewalk every week, mountains of trash. There's it could be car shares, it could be bike shares. Like there could be so many other things happening at that curb. And by the way, some of these things are things that could generate revenue for the city. They benefit many more people than just a handful of people who own gigantic gas burning private cars. So I think curbside action. Oh, and getting the delivery people involved. We have so much demand for the curb from on-demand delivery services, FedEx, UPS, Amazon. They're all just sitting out there double parked. They could be part of this too. They could be helping, if we got all of these different interests together, from the delivery companies to the bike share company, to the restaurants that want to put tables out there, to the biking and bus advocates, put all these people together in a curbside coalition and say like, hey, it's us against you guys who just want to use our curb, our public space to store your private property for free. Like, fuck you. Like, we're taking that space back. So that's my dream, is like just kind of going after the parked cars, because I really think that's where transportation policy very literally stops and ends in our cities, is like this sort of free parking at the curb.
So we're coming up on time now, and I want to ask the traditional final question that we ask to every single guest on this podcast, and that is, where should people go to learn more? I will step in and recommend people should check out Streets blog. It's a great blog about all things urbanism. They should also check out the War on Cars podcast, and we will have links to those things in the show notes. But other than the War on Cars podcast, other than Streets blog, what else would you recommend for people who are interested in what we're talking about, who want to learn more about this stuff?
I'll throw out a favorite. I mean, it's somewhat related to Streets blog, but it's Street Films. Street Films, run by my good friend and colleague Clarence Eckerson, who really, I think, over the last 20 years is a kind of unsung hero in urbanism and education, where he's put together this database of 1,000 short films that really focus on every aspect of how to make cities less automobile oriented, and all the different ways you can do it, all the different things that people are doing around the world. Streetfilms.org. It's an amazing resource. And during the time that I was I did this thing called a Loeb Fellowship up at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, and I gotta say, like, this was back in 2012, and so many graduate students came up to me and were like, "Oh my gosh, like, I got into this set of issues because of Street Films. Like, Street Films was so influential." So it's an amazing resource if you're looking to try to start to make these changes in your own community, especially.
All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for today, but hopefully we will win the war. Hopefully we will continue fighting. It's a vicious fight, but I want to thank my guest, Aaron Naparstek, for coming on the show today. Aaron, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was really fun. Not too many podcasts let you just sort of blab about, like, curbside policy. So I really appreciate it.
Always.